Let's get this over with. I am Sid Crosby's best friend. We were happy to loan him to you for the Olympics. Everybody in Pittsburgh was rooting for Canada, actually. And I'm also really pleased to be back in London. I was here in September, I think it was, right, Martha? The London Community Foundation invited me to come and speak about community foundation work and share some of my experiences with the board. And I have to say I fell in love with the board. I was going to hijack them and bring them back to my place, but I thought that wasn't quite in the spirit of the thing. Glenn Pearson, who's in the back of the room somewhere, and I have decided that we're long-lost brothers. He's the older brother, I want to make it clear. But I really am delighted, and when I got the invitation to, Glenn called me up and he said, we really need you to come and speak at this conference, and I said, I'd love to, but I'm supposed to be in Austin, I can't be there, and Glenn said, you're coming to this conference? And I said, yes, sir. So, my older brother spoke, and it's so great actually to be here and be able to talk a little bit about our experience. What I want to do is share with you some work that we've done in Pittsburgh and some insights that I think pertain to the challenges that you're facing in London, but I want to be very clear that we have not figured it out, and I cannot swear that the insights I'm sharing with you apply to London. But we go from our own experience, and I'm speaking from what I've seen in Pittsburgh and in other places, and hopefully you'll take from it what is of value to you in your work in London. So I decided to title my talk 9 Steps Forward, or How to Avoid the Zombie Apocalypse. I will explain myself in a moment as to why it's called that. But I want to just share with you for a moment my experience in coming to Pittsburgh. I was not a native Pittsburgher. Pittsburgh's an interesting town. It has more people living within a mile of where they were born than any large city in America. People love Pittsburgh. If they're from Pittsburgh, they stay in Pittsburgh or they come back to Pittsburgh. And I understand that sounds familiar. And the sense that I had when I came to Pittsburgh in 1991 was actually one of great discomfort. I was coming from Washington, D.C. I was coming from Capitol Hill. Everybody at my age, which was in my early 30s, coming from Capitol Hill, thinks that we were operating at the center of the universe. If you've watched The West Wing, you know what this is about. And we all thought we were the West Wing, right? So this was a great place to be. And then I moved to Pittsburgh and immediately felt out of place. And I could not, some of it was obvious. Like there were issues around gender equity that I could tell we were behind the times on. There were issues around race that the community was desperately behind the times on. But there was another thing that I couldn't quite put my finger on until a friend of mine in the community wrote an op-ed, and he came up with a name for it, which, oh, there we go. So this is what Pittsburgh was suffering from when I arrived there in 1991. And this is the perfect name to capture the spirit of the community. Mass hysterical low self-esteem. So we pathologize everything these days, and I've decided to diagnose the psychopathology of mass hysterical low SE, as they would call it on the ads on TV. And it's you hear it. You know you're living in a community that suffers from this when you get in a cab and you say you're visiting from out of town, and they say why. And if you've moved there and you say I've moved to this town, people will say, why? And that's very disconcerting, but what people are externalizing is this sense of, we've lost so much. And in Pittsburgh, when I arrived, these were the dynamics that the community was dealing with. So this sense of jobs and industry having gone away, of young people leaving, of, everybody spoke about when we were the city of champions. Everybody spoke about Pittsburgh in the past tense. And there was no forward-looking, and no sense that we were relevant. There were some really pathetic attempts to make us cool, by saying we were cool, but this deeply embedded crisis of relevance in a world that, by the way, every city between the West Coast and the East Coast feels. Because we're living in a bi-coastal continent, And the sense of momentum tends to be on the coasts, and people in the middle are left wondering about what their mission is as a community. So this was Pittsburgh when I arrived in 1991. And it was pretty much that way for a long time during the 90s. I did not like the town, to be candid, for the first 10 years that I lived there, which is a long time to be in a place you're not terribly enamored of. But it had great livability and great other factors. And then, if you fast forward now 20 years, Pittsburgh is a completely different place. Like I said, we haven't solved the problems by any means, but this is just a partial list of the best of lists that Pittsburgh has appeared on in the last 3 years. So suddenly we're hip, we're the best foodie city in America, we're the most livable city in America, one of the places you have to visit before you die. I don't get that list, but anyway, so all of a sudden Pittsburgh has transformed, and the question is, how did we get there? And the only way that I can think about this is to share with you a joke that I read. I was reading Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Eat, Pray, Love, at the time. And she tells this joke, which is an old joke. And I apologize that probably half of you in the room have heard this joke, but the joke so perfectly captures the transformation that Pittsburgh had that I have to share it. So the joke was that there's a man who every day on his way to work stops in front of the statue of his favorite saint, and he prays, "Please, please, please, let me win the lottery." And he does this every day, day after day. "Please, please, 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 let me win the lottery." And this goes on day after day, year after year, until finally the exasperated statue reaches down and says, "Please, please, 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 please buy a ticket." And what was so perfect about that for me, the reason that joke grabbed me, was that what had been missing in Pittsburgh was a sense of agency. So the city was waiting for the perfect leader, the perfect company, or the past to come back, and for someone else to come along and save it. And if you look at why Pittsburgh today is different than it was 20 years ago, I firmly believe it's because people like people in this room, and groups very much like the group in this room, took charge of their own destiny. So if you look at where we were 20 years ago, we were a city where the school systems weren't working, where we really perceived ourselves as yesterday's news, where the reputation of the city was still the one that had been forged during the heyday of the steel industry, when we were described as hell with the lid off. A city known purely for steel became a city known for its school reform efforts, known now as Kidsburg, for a merger of technology and education, known as one of the premier green building cities in North America, known for the tech industries, including being called Roboburg in the Wall Street Journal. Remarkable transformation. And, I could talk about at length way more than you want to hear about any one of these. What I've chosen to do is focus on one, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end about the rest. But I want to talk a little bit about our riverfront transformation as an example of what I'm talking about. And the concept that I want to convey is, I'll deal with that at the end rather than presaging it. So this is Pittsburgh. This is what we were for much of our existence, and many people alive in Pittsburgh today still think very, very fondly of this Pittsburgh. So we were the steel capital of the world. This is a picture of Pittsburgh this is daytime. This is daytime. The industry and soot was so thick that men who all wore white shirts in those days would change their shirts at midday. This is the riverfront in the industrial era. This is also riverfront in an area called the Strip District, which is the warehouse district. And this is what is today known as Point State Park, with a highway and warehouses and bridges connecting at what is the signature landmark in Pittsburgh, which is the Point. Today it looks like this. So what happened to go from this to this? Well, color photography happened, but there was a commitment, and it actually began 50 years ago. The reclamation of the Point began 50 years ago with the creation of what was Point State Park. But 50 years along, that great victory had sort of been forgotten. And Pittsburgh still had a relationship with its riverfronts that you would expect from a city that looked like this. People grew up in Pittsburgh, and what they were told was, don't go near the rivers. Because the rivers were unsafe and dirty and toxic. So about 15 years ago, a group of city leaders, self-defined, they included foundations, they included some civic leaders, they included business people, they included stakeholders in the rivers who just liked riverfront trails and things like that, decided that something big was about to happen along the riverfront. And the big thing was that all of this land that stretched along the rivers was suddenly becoming available. And there were huge parcels that were no longer going to be used for industrial purposes. So there was a chance to reinvent about 16 miles of downtown riverfront in the heart of downtown, where the two rivers come together, the Monongahela and the Allegheny, to form the Ohio. Pittsburgh's signature place, and the center of its downtown. David McCullough, the historian, was invited to come and speak to us about the history of the region. And one of the things that David said was, what you are presented with is not a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity or a once-in-a-generation opportunity. This is a once-in-a-century opportunity for you to redefine what your city is about and to rethink what is possible, not just reclaim land in a different way, but to rethink what is possible in the life of your city. So that was pretty inspiring. People began to work on that and formed a thing that we're pretty good at in Pittsburgh, which was a public-private partnership. And I can tell you that it consisted of the folks I mentioned. So we had the mayor, we had city council members, we had business leaders, we had property owners, because the land along the riverfront was owned by multiple stakeholders. And we had people who just cared about the riverfront and wanted to see something great happen there. And most of the participants in what was then called the River Life Task Force were there somewhat reluctantly, because they had a hard time conceiving of the rivers being something different than what I showed you in those photos. Meanwhile, at around the same time, and don't try and read this slide, it's way too deep, I don't know what I was thinking. But meanwhile, there was something happening in Pittsburgh where a group of foundations had decided that Pittsburgh, this city that was known as hell with the lid off, could become a green building leader. And foundations started funding green building. A few models were created. One of the first was actually created by this guy in the upper left-hand corner, Bill McDonough, who is an architect working for the Hines family and Teresa Hines Carey, who designed an office to show what green design could look like. And that actually began to take hold. A nonprofit was formed to advocate for green building. A local company called PNC Bank, which is now the nation's 5th largest bank, adopted green building as a logical business move in the design of all of their buildings. And suddenly, lo and behold, a decade later, Pittsburgh was one of the top green building cities in the United States. 10 years earlier, when we talked about that, people laughed. It was a crazy idea. How could Pittsburgh, hell with the lid off, ever become a green building and sustainability center? Same reaction at the time that we were talking about the rivers. And this just gives you, you'll see this diagram a few too many times. I'll run through this quickly. But this is the area of the 16-mile loop that we decided would make a great downtown park. It covers about the same landmass, a little larger as Central Park in Manhattan, and represented an extraordinary opportunity to redefine what downtown was about. The little red dot on the upper river, which is called the Allegheny River, was one of the places where we began. The city was in the process of rebuilding its convention center. It had a large, big box, and the notion for the new convention center was to make the medium-sized box into a extra large box. And that was as good as it got. And the notion in Pittsburgh was, this is as good as we can get. Because we're a struggling city, we have a struggling economy, we don't have money. And so a group of foundations challenged the community and said, look, let's do a design competition and see what could happen if this were a really beautiful building, an inspiring building, and a green building. And so we did a design competition, found a design, ultimately settled on a design by an architect named Raphael Vignoli, and turned this convention center into the nation's first and largest green convention center and the largest green building in North America. Also connected the riverfront on both sides so that people could actually experience the river and not just experience the convention center. And it was as beautiful on the city side as it was on the river side. It was designed to mimic a sail along the riverfront. So the point of that exercise was to signal early that something great could happen on the river and that we didn't have to settle for mediocrity. That was a really important message, because what was beginning to happen as this conversation was happening on the riverfront was that a couple of developments were being undertaken that were the height of mediocrity. And what came back to us from city leaders was, that's as good as we can have. We're an economically struggling city. This is as good as a city like ours can aspire to. So that became a theme that we have had to actually combat. If you think you prove it wrong once, you're wrong. What we've learned is that you have to keep proving this wrong. But it gets a little bit easier each time you do it. So the next thing we looked at was Point State Park, which was that park on the point which had originally transformed the city and created a new icon in the heart of downtown. But after 50 years, it was incredibly dilapidated and beginning to fall apart. And some really stupid things had been done on this site. So we looked at changing this, for example, and this looks really historic, doesn't it? This is actually meant to be the foundation of the old Fort Duquesne fort, which was on this site. And the notion was this was the outline of the foundation, and it's complete fakery. It was just put there to evoke history. It isn't actually historic, but when we began talking to people about getting rid of this, the hue and cry about change was unbelievable, because how could we change something that had been in place for 50 years? But the truth was, nobody used this park on this side. This is what's called the city side of the park. The other thing about this site that was extraordinary was it was all about what you could not do. I would go there when my kids were young, and I was just stunned by all the rules of the things you could not do. So this was a city of don'ts. If you came here, you learned what you were not able to do, which is exactly the wrong message for a community to send. So changing signage is easy, but changing the experience is a little more difficult. And we just redesigned the park by flattening it and making it accessible to kids, and it is now one of the most used parts of downtown, both at special events and during the day for kids playing games and other things. And it has become a source of pride for the community that is used year-round, even in the bitterly cold weather, surprisingly. So from there, we had to look at leveraging another opportunity, which was on the north shore of the river. And I'm spending too much time on these things, but we had another incredible opportunity to leverage change by looking at an effort that was underway by the city to build new stadiums in what is called the North Shore. And this is pretty much what it looked like. When we commissioned a designer from Harvard named Alex Creeder to come and look at Pittsburgh, what he told us is Pittsburgh is a fantastic city if you're a car. because the best places in Pittsburgh, the best views, the best, it's all along the riverfront. And so this entire vast expanse had either been the old stadium or had been parking lots. And it's the most gorgeous spot in Pittsburgh. So we again talked to all of the stakeholders about what could be possible if we made this beautiful. And you know, it was not easy, because the mayor the mayor at that time was a pretty good guy, but his idea was all you need to do is have a trail along the riverfront, and that'll be enough. We thought, you know, this ought to be like the front lawn for the community, and that's what we ended up creating. It has become another gathering spot as prominent as the point. And when we play baseball and have football games over there, there are now people wandering the shoreline all the time and riding bikes along the shoreline all the time. Then we had a piece of this that really spoke to the heart and soul of what Pittsburgh was about, an image that is an icon for Pittsburgh, and it's the fountain at the point. People in Pittsburgh grow up with memories of their time at the fountain, of experiences that they've had at the fountain. And it had worn out. It had become dilapidated and old and kind of gross. It was surrounded by signs of what you couldn't do, and people still came, especially for special events, but not as often, and it was often deserted. So we decided that we needed to reinvent the fountain and make it into something extraordinary, which we managed to do through a combination of public and private funding. What's extraordinary about this to me, and what I want you to hear, is when we did this work in Pittsburgh, now this is about 15 years into the effort, and we've done those other things, and we've reconnected a lot of the riverfront, and we've created beautiful parkland, and developers are now getting it, that their property values go up when they're next to something that people want to use and that's beautiful. So they're beginning to build better developments adjacent to this riverfront. What we heard throughout the building of this fountain was, it's taking too long, you're spending too much money, we can't afford it, we don't need something that good. I cannot tell you how many times I heard, we cannot afford something that good. And when a community convinces itself that it cannot afford something that good, it becomes something less than good. I firmly believe. So we knew we had to create something that was spectacular, and we managed to marshal the resources to do that. And today, you cannot visit the fountain at almost any hour of the day or night. A city where people learned and grew up, stay away from the water. You can't go there without being surrounded by crowds of people who are proposing to each other, which is great, or just playing or waiting in the fountain, which they're not supposed to do. They get chased out. They go back. It's great. And then just as one more example, I just wanted to show you this photo. This is what the shoreline looked along the south shore, and there's a huge development going up at the top of that. And the traditional approach in Pittsburgh would have been do the development, forget about the shoreline. We decided, again, to create a signature shoreline so that now we're getting this sort of park all along the 16-mile loop. And this is what's happening. And then I just love this picture too. This is an area called the Mon Wharf. It floods all the time. This was used as a parking lot and as a flooding area. That's pretty much how it looked. It's an important link, actually, if you're riding your bike from Washington, D.C. to the point, which you can do now. You would have to pass along this. So we turned it into that. And again, people complained, and the number one thing they complained about is, I've lost parking. Okay. This project, as you imagine, is enormously expensive. We've marshaled about $130 million so far in what I showed you. It's a combination of public and private money. Some foundation money, significant portion of foundation money, some corporate money, some public money. If any of us had said at the outset of this project that we were going to spend $120 million, everybody would have laughed at us and said, where is that going to come from? We managed to do it piece by piece by approaching it with a grand vision that was broken up into manageable chunks that we could find money for. And so what I want to do is just talk about this for a moment from the context. I want to park this case in your mind, and I want to tease out what, for me, are the important things that you have to keep in mind when you're trying to change a community for the good and do a project like this. And the same applies to the work we've done in the schools. The same applies to the, we've got an extraordinary mayor right now in Pittsburgh, a guy named Bill Peduto. I'm going to mention him in a second, but we spent a long time waiting for a mayor like this, and we're actually screening his new hires for his new administration because he wants to eliminate corruption and patronage from office, which is extraordinary. He follows a mayor before him who would not work with us and would not work with the design community on any of these projects, and whose administration is still under investigation by the FBI. There's hope. But there are 9 things that I've learned from this work, and I want to share with you. And this one seems so banally obvious that you may say, why is he saying this? There are plenty of people in the United States, and I suppose it's probably true in Canada today, particularly if they're incredibly wealthy, if they're from other places, if they're deeply into the tech world, or if they're the opposite and sort of disconnected. There's a sense that place doesn't matter the way it used to. And they're wrong. The craving and the desire for authenticity and shared experiences runs deep in the human soul. It is the thing that defines us. I firmly believe that we, you all know from science class that plants bend towards the light, right? I believe that we're creatures of light and creatures of purpose, and that we will bend towards greatness if we're given that. And one of the places where we're able to do that is in the context of place where we can have authentic and shared experiences. We trivialize that by imagining that this is place. I love Starbucks. I know where every Starbucks is in North America. And that's plenty of times me. But this is not community. And the conceit that community no longer matters is a conceit of people who are not paying attention to where the rest of us send our children to school, where we go to work, where we shop, where we connect, where we meet with friends, where we tell stories about the places we knew as children. This is community. This is just a program called City of Asylum in Pittsburgh, and real community forces us up against each other in places where we actually have to rub elbows with folks who may not look like us or think like us, but we get a sense of being in a community of human beings. And if there's one thing that we have to keep in mind when you're doing community work, it is ultimately not just about disembodied things like we need jobs. Of course you need jobs. You need a place that people love. Place matters. The second point is that change only happens in a community context in which the people there believe that this place matters. So a lot of people in Pittsburgh, when I first arrived there, didn't believe this. It actually fell to groups like Emerging Leaders in London. We had our own counterparts in Pittsburgh, to come along and say, no, you're wrong. You know, Pittsburgh really, this is a great place. We've got great assets. We ought to be, we're still relevant. We ought to be cool. I grew up in the West. I actually grew up in Denver, Colorado. I'm a native Australian. I'm actually much cooler than you think I am. But I lost the accent because I grew up in Denver. So in the West, when I was growing up, we had lots of ghost towns. You could go visit them. The world's becoming so crowded, we don't have ghost towns anymore. A lot of the ones that I knew as a kid are now like really hip, cool places where tech companies are locating. So we're not in a planet of 7 billion people, we're not going to see a lot of these anymore. But we are going to see what I call zombie towns. And zombie towns come in 2 flavors. They're the old ones that are on decline, and they're the new ones that we're building where they're nothing more than strip malls. But these are towns that have lost their point. They've lost their sense of history. They've lost their passion. They don't know what they're about. And the challenge for anybody working in the sort of context that either a Pittsburgh or a London is to be very cognizant of this is the fear. This is what we don't want to be. We do not want to be a city that has lost its passion and its point and its purpose. So how do we begin to do that? I said before that in Pittsburgh we were sitting and waiting for the right leader to come along, and here's what I've learned. Leaders lead. If your leaders are not leading, guess what? They're not your leaders. So the question for you is, who is? Who are the leaders of this community? And what emerged in Pittsburgh was, we had some good leadership, just as you do, but we couldn't see the political sphere. We knew we had multiple spheres of leadership. We had business leaders who cared about Pittsburgh. We had what we call the social sector in our community, which was universities, nonprofits who were engaged in changing the community, foundations, and just individuals and groups like this. And then we had, obviously, the political sphere. The previous mayor in Pittsburgh started his administration by meeting with a group of us who cared about this set of issues and telling us, well, he dropped the F-bomb on us, and he said, I don't need you. I don't want to work with you. Get out of my office. So that's a sign. And it would have been very easy at that moment to say, we're done. We can't really do our work without the mayor. And we decided that wasn't true. Because we still had these other 2 spheres, and we actually had leaders as well in the political arena, just not the mayor and his team. What I want to suggest, with all due respect to the man who you've really come here to hear from, is that if you're sitting here waiting for Mayor Nenshi to appear suddenly in London, you're going to be waiting a long time. Leadership is something you can take right now, even though you don't have the mayor that you wish you had. And then, if you do this well, you'll create the circumstance by which you will have your own Mayor Nenshi. In Pittsburgh, that's a guy named Bill Peduto, who has completely transformed the landscape in our town in the last few months by coming in as a reformer, and he's now reached out to every one of the groups that the previous mayor dismissed. But it was a long time waiting for him to arrive, and you have to decide whether you're going to lead or whether you're going to wait for someone else to come along and do it for you. In order to make that leap, I have to share with you that your biggest problem really is what you think you know right now. In any town, every town I've spoken in that shares any commonality with Pittsburgh, here's something that we're limited by. We believe that we are limited. We believe that we are broke. We believe that we don't have resources. We believe that we are insufficient in some way, shape, or form. And those low expectations will kill you every time, because you cannot improve on behalf of a low bar. Nobody in the history of mankind has been inspired by easy. So the question is, and the question that you and Pittsburgh had to answer is, what do we have that's really great? If we had more time, I'd ask you to break into groups and answer that question and talk with each other about why you're here. We don't, because I have to yield the floor eventually to the mayor. But what do you have that's worthy of greatness? In Pittsburgh, we had this little square called Market Square. Looks pleasant enough. A lot of people said this is good enough. Now, the problem with this square is people were afraid to come to it. Shop owners would not open shops around it. It was the center of drug dealing in downtown Pittsburgh. looks innocuous, doesn't it? But there were design problems with it that made it possible for it to be used in that way. So, again, through a public-private partnership, we redesigned the square and made it into more of a European plaza. There are now restaurants all around it. There are people populating it day and night. It is one of the most popular destinations for people to come and visit. And it's, again, because the city decided we have to set the bar higher than we have. Same thing happened with the fountain. But to get to that, you also have to understand, and this is a hard thing to internalize when you're working on a city's problems, is that you cannot improve by focusing on your deficiencies. The community that focuses on its strengths is the one that triumphs. So again, you have to ask what you're good at as a community and could be great at. Now in Pittsburgh, the way we went about answering that question was, we had great academic resources at the universities. We're really good at technology. We had experience in urban design. We were getting good at sustainability. We had this great parks network. We had a history of public-private partnerships, and we had a bunch of people who were committed to various aspects of the city. So the question was, how could we tie those together? And what I want to underscore for you is that everybody who is studying how cities improve today will point to the same notion that a city must understand what is good about this place, its place, and focus on how it can become great at that thing that it is good at. Bruce Katz, who is at the Brookings Institution, is a friend, and he has been studying this in cities all around North America. He's identified, he actually left Pittsburgh out of this book because of our mayoral leadership, which was sad. But what he identified for cities is very simple. He said, focus on what you're good at and leverage that. Make that your priority. And the other thing he said was, then work together. So this is something that is also hard, and it goes back to the waiting for Superman syndrome that so many of us are prone to. Networks will trump superheroes in an age of distributed leadership. And that's what we live in. We do not live in Pittsburgh in the 1950s, two people decided to clean up the city of Pittsburgh when its pollution was at its worst. Richard King Mellon, who headed Mellon Bank, and David Lawrence, who was the mayor. Today, there is no Richard King Mellon, there is no David Lawrence. Power is distributed across wide networks. So to triumph in today's world, you need to form networks that are effective and powerful. And give up the idea of the superhero who is going to save you, because you all together are the superhero if you form the right kind of network. In Pittsburgh, we have now gotten to the point where there is not one single coalition on anything. We now form coalitions of coalitions. It's really kind of annoying to hold a meeting in Pittsburgh, actually. But we have countless networks that are working on how to improve the city, and they come together in their own coalitions to support progress. 3 other quick points. This starts with empathy. I firmly believe that one of the sins that we've committed in the past when we try and design or improve upon cities is to have, again, that Superman complex where we think one person or one group of people know best. No successful city improvement effort in America is happening where we are not listening to residents and asking them what they really need. I'm a huge believer in design thinking, which has been popularized by firms like IDEO and the Stanford D School at Stanford University. The central tenet of design thinking, of designing a product or a thing that people will value and want to use, or a community that they want to live in, is by asking them what it is that they really need from that community. I actually think you've done that with the plan that's been developed here. It's a very impressive plan, and it demonstrates a very impressive amount of listening. I would recommend a book to you if you haven't read it, Peter Sim's Little Bets, which talks about design thinking as a practice. I think it has great application to community work for 2 reasons. One is that it talks about this notion of empathy and how you can get good at building empathy into your efforts to improve your city. So because it talks about iteration and how you can experiment and keep experimenting to improve. Now that said, empathy being as important as it is, I also believe that eventually you just have to build a car. So you all have a plan, and it's a good plan. You've got great discussions going on around the riverfront, and you should involve as many people as you can and talk to them as often as you can and find out from them what they really want. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to do something. So the reason that I use this language is Henry Ford has a famous quote that he probably did not say, which was that if I'd asked my customers what they really want, they'd have said a faster horse. And what that does get at is the notion that at some point, people who are caring about change have to input their own thinking about how to do it. And they have to come up with the genius idea that will inspire. Take it beyond just what we're hearing to the inspiration around design. So how you move from listening to action, finding pieces of a grand plan that you can implement, which is what we did on the riverfront. We had a grand plan, but we built it piece by piece, and we're still in the middle of doing that. So this is a great example of where we did that. One of the first things we built along the riverfront was water steps for people to come down and actually experience what it was like to touch the water. Shocking, but it changed the mentality in a town where they grew up thinking that they couldn't go near the water. And then finally, again, the concept from design thinking is that every step is a chance to learn. So what we have learned by taking this step-by-step iterative approach that is deeply rooted in design thinking is that we get better at it. You know, the first time you do this, you don't listen so well, you don't hear so well, you don't create so well, you're imposing your own will too much. But as you do this, you get better at it, and you iterate your way forward. And again, we just did that with the riverfront. It is not my place to tell you what you ought to do, but this is what I have learned from the work we've done in Pittsburgh. You start by finding out what you value, and you build on that. So you focus not on what's wrong with London or Pittsburgh. You focus on what's great about London or Pittsburgh. In organizational theory, this is what's known as appreciative inquiry. And then you move into connecting and convening all of the people who care about those same things. And you find out why they care about it and how you can build on their passion to get to the ends that you want to achieve. You listen and you learn and you iterate and you try again and you fail. And accepting failure is a huge part of this sort of approach. Because in this kind of work, if you're making 2 steps forward and 1.5 back, that's great progress. And you have to be willing to accept failure along the way. But we listen and we learn, we dream and we iterate, and we keep getting better at this process of building the community that we want to create. Now, my big brother sent me a copy of his book called A Place for Us, and I read it. And his last line in this book, I think, is the most telling thing. I think it is, it's a fabulous book, by the way. I commend it to you if you haven't read it. This is true of most cities that are struggling with the issues that we did in Pittsburgh and that you are in London. We've lost a sense of ourselves somewhere along the way. And we've lost that sense of purpose and the thread of our story. We can get it back. And the primary way we get it back is by believing in each other and ourselves enough to create the community that we would want to live in, where we can bump up against each other and where we can actually create the sort of shared destiny that will inspire us not to settle for mediocre. My parting comment to you is, I've been here twice, and I can already tell from the people in this room, this is a great town. And it's got a deep reservoir of love and affection for what London represents. The way that you will achieve that and turn it into the reality that you have in your minds is by meeting like this and doing the hard work of creating a community where people want to come together. So do that. Do that thing. Thank you.